You reckon folks climb this big old mountain for glory. But sometimes the mountain just takes them for making the smallest, dumbest mistakes ever seen. Up here where the air is thinner than a ghost's whisper, death don't always come roaring like a lion, but creeps in quiet like frost. Most folks think it takes a storm to kill you, but truth is, plain old stupidity kills more climbers than the fiercest blizzard ever could. Take this fellow Daniel here, dragging his boots up the slope like they were made of lead, ignoring the hiss that sounded like a snake. He stopped right there on the ice, chest heaving like a dying engine, oblivious to the fact that his lifeline was leaking straight into the wind. That fancy ivory face of his showed nothing, but underneath the mask, his lungs were screaming for air that was escaping through a hairline crack. Frost was creeping over the black rubber like mold on stale bread, sealing his fate tight, while the sun just glared down cold and hard. The sun up here might look bright enough to blind you, but it offers no warmth to a man slowly suffocating inside his own expensive gear. He looked down at his chest harness, staring right at the problem, but his brain was too starved of oxygen to see the devil at work. White ice was growing around that metal valve like a cancer, blocking the flow of life just enough to make a man feel mighty tired. A steady stream of precious vapor was hissing out into the void, a sound so faint you would miss it unless you were listening for death. He tapped that plastic gauge with a nervous finger, watching the needle tremble, wondering why the mountain suddenly felt heavy enough to crush his weary bones. The light caught the escaping gas just right, showing a plume of white death drifting away, leaving him with nothing but empty lungs and confusion. Another climber came up behind him, a Sherpa who knew the signs, reaching out a hand to check the gear that was clearly failing him. But pride is a funny thing at high altitude, so Daniel just waved that helping hand away with a stiff motion, sealing his own dark fate. Even without a face to show it, you could tell he was irritated, thinking he knew better than the mountain or the man trying to help. The world around him was turning into a blurry mess of white and blue, and his judgment was fading faster than the daylight in a canyon. All he could hear was the swishing of his own suit in the wind, drowning out the voice of reason that might have saved his life. He was falling behind the pack now, a lone red speck on a massive sheet of ice, taking steps that looked more like a funeral march. Every step was an agonizing struggle against gravity, and with that leaking valve, he was fighting a battle he had already lost 10 minutes ago. He stopped right there, leaning heavy on his axe like an old man, while the slope just shone like polished glass under that cruel sun. The wind was whipping up little snakes of white powder that danced around his boots, waiting for him to drop so they could bury him. You could hear the rasp of his breathing echoing in that plastic mask, a wet and heavy sound that meant his lungs were filling up. He tried to clip his safety line, but his hands were shaking so bad inside those thick mittens that he looked like a frightened child. That yellow rope was frozen stiff as a dead man's finger, covered in crystals that cut into his gloves while he fought to stay attached. Panic started setting in like a rot, making his heart hammer against his ribs, while the cold air just laughed at his clumsy, freezing fingers. He leaned his blank white head against the wall of blue ice, too exhausted to stand up straight, sliding down inch by agonizing inch. His mask had slipped sideways on his face, but he was too far gone to notice that the life-giving gas was venting straight into the sky. The sunlight was filtering through the blowing snow, making the whole world look like a hazy dream right before a man closes his eyes forever. He looked down at his own boots, and they seemed 100 miles away, moving on their own like they belonged to some other stranger. The edges of his vision were starting to go dark, shrinking the world down to a tiny tunnel of white snow and jagged black rock. He stumbled forward like a drunk leaving a saloon, catching himself on the line just before gravity could drag him down to the bottomless void. That tight nylon rope hummed like a guitar string under the tension, the only thing keeping him from tumbling all the way down to hell. Inside his ears, the sound of his own heart was thumping, slow and heavy, a funeral drum beating out the last few seconds of his time. His legs finally gave out underneath him, folding up like wet cardboard, and he crumpled down onto the hard ice without making a single sound. He lay there, curled up on the slope, looking for all the world like a broken doll that some careless child left out in the winter. That regulator was still hissing away beside his ear, mocking him with the sound of the oxygen that could have saved him if he checked. The wind didn't waste no time, blowing drifts of fine white powder over his red suit, starting the work of hiding him from the world. From a distance, he was just a speck of red on a field of white, a warning sign for anyone else foolish enough to be careless. It wasn't the mountain that killed him, but a tiny little rubber washer that failed, proving that small mistakes cast long shadows in this place. The mountain doesn't mourn the dead, it just freezes them in place, turning a living man into a permanent statue of ice and regret. His red suit is fading now under the snow, a grim landmark for the next poor soul who thinks he can conquer this rock. One turn of a wrench could have saved him, but he was too proud to look. And now he sleeps here for eternity. Now look at this fellow here in the yellow suit, climbing straight up a gully that acts like a funnel for the wind. They call it spindrift, but that sounds too pretty for a river of ice crystals pouring down the mountain to drown you alive. It flows over the rock like water, filling every crack and crevice, seeking a way inside your clothes to steal your body heat. Victor was pushing hard against the flow, head down and shoulders hunched, trying to swim upstream against a river of freezing white dust. His goggles were frosted over completely, and that oxygen mask felt like a muzzle strapped tight across his face, choking off his air. Panic starts in the gut when you cannot breathe, twisting tight until you feel like tearing off the very thing keeping you alive. The ice was caking up the intake valves, turning that expensive regulator into a useless lump of plastic that wouldn't let air through. He shook his head like a mad dog, trying to clear the blockage, but the ice just stuck there like it was glued. A cough started deep in his chest, a dry and hacking rattle that shook his whole body and made his vision go swimming. He made the choice, right then, a desperate and foolish choice, reaching up with gloved hands to unclasp the straps behind his head. He pulled that mask away from his face, thinking he would get a lungful of fresh air, but he only swallowed pure ice. That smooth white face of his was naked now, exposed to 60 degrees below zero and a wind that cuts like a razor. The spindrift didn't wait a second, rushing into his open mouth and nose, filling his throat with powder dry enough to kill. He doubled over on the rope, retching and gagging, realizing too late that the air up here is not meant for breathing naked. The cold slammed into his lungs like a hammer, freezing the moisture inside instantly and shutting down his ability to take a breath. His hands were clawing at his throat, but you cannot claw out the cold once it settles deep inside your core like iron. His knees started to buckle under the weight of his own mistake, and the mountain waited patiently to catch him when he fell. He stood there, swaying in that narrow gully like a drunkard, wiping frantically at goggles that were blinded by the white fury of the storm. That regulator was packed tight with snow, turning his lifeline into a choke collar, and he shook his head trying to rattle it loose. You could hear the wet hacking cough tearing through his chest as he clawed at his throat, desperate to get that freezing devil out. Panic took the wheel and drove him off the cliff, making his clumsy fingers unclip the straps and pull that mask away from his face. The moment that ivory skin hit the air, it was like stepping into a fire, with ice crystals sticking to him like white needles. He stumbled sideways, inhaling a lungful of jagged ice particles that cut him up inside, bending him double under the weight of his regret. The world started spinning like a top as he reached out a trembling hand for the rope, missing it once before gripping the line. His legs finally quit on him, dropping him hard onto the blue ice, and those metal cramps scraped uselessly against the unforgiving mountain floor. He tried to push himself up, but his arms were shaking like leaves, and that useless mask just dangled there, swinging in the gale. He curled up tight as a baby in a crib, letting the river of white snow wash over him, burying his mistakes forevermore. A crust of ice started forming on his cheek, sealing his blank face away while the fine powder filled the gaps in his collar. The yellow of his suit was fading fast under the white drifts, and the mountain howled a lonely song for the man it claimed. Looking up from the bottom of the world, the sky turned a dark and bruised blue as the snow kept piling on his lens. The mountain just kept pouring its cold white sand over him, making him look smaller and smaller against the vast, uncaring face of rock. That abandoned mask lay there in the snow, whistling a high and lonesome tune as the wind blew through the vents he foolishly opened. Time moves fast when you are freezing to death, and the drifts rose up around him until he was nothing but a white mound. His hand was still reaching out from the grave, fingers tipped with long icicles, frozen in a final plea for help that never came. Night fell like a heavy curtain, leaving nothing but silence, and the silhouette of the ridge where Victor slept in his cold white tomb. Now look at this mess at the Hillary Step, a traffic jam at the top of the world where waiting is a death sentence. Lucas, here in the blue suit, was getting mighty restless, tapping his fingers on his tank and watching his precious time tick slowly away. The line was moving slower than molasses in January, and Lucas could feel the itch in his bones to get moving or die trying. He looked at that safety line, keeping him tethered to the world, and decided he did not need it anymore, snapping that silver gate open. He stepped off the beaten path onto the loose rock, thinking he was smarter than the herd, but the mountain was waiting to humble him. The rush of moving fast felt good for a moment, his boots crunching on the ice as he passed the slow folks left behind him. But the shortcut was a graveyard of old ropes, a tangled mess of frozen lines left by dead men who thought they knew the way. He squeezed through a narrow gap in the rock, and a loop of green rope reached out like a hand to grab his tank. He twisted like a fish on a hook, trying to shake it loose, but that old rope held on tight with a grip of iron. In his panic to get free, his boots slipped on the black ice, and suddenly there was nothing under his feet but empty air. He fell hard against the wall, flipped upside down by the very thing that snagged him, dangling there like a puppet with cut strings. He was pinned tight against the cold blue ice, the rope cutting into his suit, while his breath came in short and terrified gasps. He could see the others passing by just yards away, but they were too busy staring at their boots to notice a dying man. Every breath he took made the rope tighten around his chest, squeezing the life out of him slowly while the wind drowned his screams. He thrashed around in that rock chimney, scraping his suit against the stone, but fighting only made the trap bite down harder on him. He tried to pull a knife with those clumsy mittens, but his frozen fingers fumbled, and the blade fell away into the dark abyss. The sun moved on and left him in the shadow, a lonely blue speck caught in the teeth of the mountain with no escape. The cold started to seep into his bones as he hung there, his energy fading fast as the day turned toward a freezing night. He could see the yellow safety line swinging in the wind just out of reach, mocking him for the choice he made to leave it. He gave one last weak kick against the wall, but his legs were heavy as lead and the mountain refused to let him go. The needle on his gauge was dropping toward zero, ticking away the last few minutes of air he had left in this cruel world. From a distance, he looked like just another piece of trash left behind, a blue scrap of fabric tangled in the rocks forevermore. The night swallowed him whole, and that little electric light on his head started flickering like a dying firefly trapped in a jar. Those ropes that snagged him turned into bars of solid ice, locking him in a prison made of his own impatience and bad luck. High above the world, the silence is so deep it hurts your ears, broken only by the wind roaring like a freight train. When the sun finally crawled back over the ridge, it found him frozen solid, a blue statue waiting for a rescue that never came. Icicles hung from his fingertips like diamond claws, and that expensive watch on his wrist was frozen over, marking a time that didn't matter. The tragedy of it all was that his shortcut led nowhere but a straight drop down to hell, stopping just short of the edge. The other climbers kept on marching past on the main trail, heads down against the wind, never knowing a man was dying nearby. The wind whipped a loose strap against his frozen suit, beating a rhythmic tattoo that sounded like a drum for the dead man walking. The storm cleared just enough to show his face, one last time, smooth and white and empty as the moon on a winter night. He was just a blue dot now in a world of white, swallowed up by the clouds and left behind by the living world. The sun went down again and cast long shadows over his resting place, turning the ice into gold while he slept the eternal sleep. The drifting snow started to cover him up like a blanket, smoothing out the rough edges until he was just part of the mountain. We leave him there in the rocks, a warning to anyone else who thinks they can outsmart the mountain by cutting a few corners. The wind wipes the slate clean, erasing the footprints and the memories, getting ready to set the stage for the next poor, unfortunate soul. Down at Camp 4, the wind was screaming like a banshee, battering the tents while Emily stumbled in from the dark, seeking some shelter. Her hands were numb and clumsy as she fought with that zipper, desperate to get inside, away from the teeth of the howling gale. She crawled into that small yellow space like a wounded animal, collapsing on the floor while the storm raged just inches away from her. She pulled that zipper all the way down to the bottom, sealing herself in tight and shutting out the wind along with the air. It felt cozy in there once she got that little gas stove roaring, burning blue and bright against the dark and freezing cold night. The flame hissed a lullaby, burning up the oxygen in that tiny space, turning her sanctuary into a gas chamber without her even knowing. She felt a cold draft on her neck and stuffed a wool sock into the vent, blocking the only fresh air she had left. The heat built up fast in that little nylon box, making her sweat like a sinner in church while the poison filled her lungs. Her vision started swimming like oil on water, and that blue flame turned a sickly yellow color as the air turned thick and deadly. A pounding headache started hammering behind her eyes, and she swayed back and forth like a reed in the wind, her mind entirely lost now. She reached out for her boots, but her hands were clumsy as blocks of wood, knocking over a water bottle instead of grabbing hold. Sudden panic seized her heart like a cold iron grip, telling her she had to escape that stifling heat or burn up right there. She tore that zipper open and burst out into the storm, steam rising off her body like a ghost escaping from a fresh grave. But the poor girl wasn't wearing nothing on her feet but wool socks, sinking deep into the freezing snow that bit like a wolf. She stumbled away from the only shelter she had, walking blindly into the whiteout with the stove still hissing behind her in the dark. Her legs folded up under her weight, and she fell hard into a drift, the cold instantly wrapping its arms around her warm body. Those gray wool socks froze stiff in a heartbeat, turning into shackles of ice that bound her tight to the frozen mountain ground forevermore. She looked back one last time just as the fuel ran dry, watching her little yellow beacon flicker out and leave her in darkness. She curled herself into a tight little ball in the snow, trying to hold on to a spark of warmth that was already long gone. The wind didn't show no mercy, piling the snow over her orange suit until she looked like nothing more than a bump in the ground. When the dawn broke cold and clear, the storm was gone, leaving behind a silent white statue where a living woman used to be. A mask of clear ice had formed over her face, preserving her blank expression like a porcelain doll left out in the winter garden. Back inside the tent, her heavy boots sat empty and waiting, a cruel reminder of the one thing she forgot in her final panic. Another climber walked right past her frozen form, glancing down but never stopping, knowing that death is just part of the scenery up here. From high above, the camp looked like a scattered graveyard, and she was just another orange dot slowly fading into the endless white vastness. The frost claimed her completely, turning the bright orange fabric into a sheet of white, sealing the story of the girl who suffocated herself. Camp 4 wakes up busy, dozens of colorful tents flapping in the wind, but that one yellow tent stands silent as a grave marker. The wind was already busy scrubbing away her footprints, turning those desperate steps into nothing but smooth white snow that tells no tales. That open tent flap just kept banging against the pole, a hollow rhythm counting out the minutes for a woman who was already gone. A passing climber cast a long shadow over her frozen form, pausing for a heartbeat before marching on toward the summit without a word. She had peeled off her gloves in the madness of the cold, leaving her bare hand to grow a garden of white frost ferns. Those empty boots sat inside the tent, looking out at the world, watching the living folks walk by while their owners slept in the snow. The mountain stood tall and proud above it all, smoking with spindrift and looking down on the dead with eyes that felt no pity. The snow kept piling up until her orange suit was just a faint stain on the white, erasing her from the memory of the camp. The ice froze that zipper shut forever, locking away the person she used to be and leaving just a bundle of clothes in the drift. We leave the camp behind now, fading into the white mist, but the mountain has one last cruel trick to play on the careless. Up on the high ridge where the wind screams like a demon, Martin stepped away from the line, seeking a moment of privacy alone. His gloved hands fumbled with the metal clip, and with one little snap, he cut the only tie binding him to the world of the living. He walked toward a flat patch of snow that looked solid enough, never knowing he was stepping onto a roof made of spun sugar. The ground vanished beneath his boots with a crack like a gunshot, dropping him straight down into the belly of the hungry blue ice. The sky spun around as he fell backward into the dark, sliding down walls of glass that were smooth enough to cheat a man. He landed hard at the bottom of a perfect blue cylinder, a trap designed by the devil himself to hold a man until doomsday. He tried to climb those slippery walls, but his metal spikes just scratched uselessly against ice that was harder than a diamond in winter. He swung his axe at the rim with all his might, but the loose snow just crumbled away, showering him with white dust and failure. From the trail above, that deadly hole looked just like flat ground, hiding its secrets so well that nobody could see the danger waiting there. He screamed for help until his throat was raw, but the wind snatched his words away before they could reach the ears of a soul. He gathered all his strength for one desperate leap at the edge, but the soft snow gave way and sent him sliding back down into the dark. The wind blew a roof of moving snow right over his head, sealing him in a quiet room while the storm raged loud just inches above him. A pair of yellow boots crunched by so close he could touch them, but the walker never looked down at the hand waving from the grave. He slumped back against the hard blue ice with a heavy heart, knowing that the chance for rescue had walked away and left him to die. The cold settled deep in his bones like a heavy weight, and white frost began to grow on his red suit like moss on a stone. The sun moved on and left him sitting in the blue shadow, a dark shape at the bottom of a well made of ice and silence. His frozen fingers tried to tie a knot, but they were useless as stone, dropping the silver clip onto the ice with a hollow clinking sound. The blue walls started to pulse and breathe like a living thing, closing in on him while a high ringing sound filled up his tired ears. He stared at his own reflection in the glassy ice, looking at a ghost that was already dead before his heart had even stopped its beating. Twilight turned the opening above into a purple bruise, and the wind whistled a low and mournful tune across the mouth of his icy prison cell. His headlamp flickered once and died, leaving him in a darkness so thick you could taste it, with only the cold for company in the night. The shivering finally stopped as his body gave up the fight, and he sat there still as a statue under the cold light of the moon. The wind kept working all night long, pouring sand-dry snow into the hole to bury the red suit and hide the evidence of the trap. He looked up at the stars one last time through the shrinking hole, watching the window to the world close up tight like a coffin lid. Morning light revealed nothing but a shallow dip in the snow, the deep pit hidden away under a fresh white crust that looked innocent and clean. A yellow climbing rope dragged right across the edge of the hole, sending a shower of snow down onto the man who could no longer feel it. The loose snow landed on his frozen shoulder, but he didn't twitch, sitting there in the blue gloom waiting for the glacier to grind him down. The wind polished the surface until the trap was invisible again, waiting patiently for the next fool to step off the path and disappear forever. The mountains rose up, jagged and cruel against the sky, indifferent to the small red tragedy hidden deep inside the belly of the eternal ice. Deep below the white surface, he sits there still, frozen in a moment of terror that has lasted for years in the silence of the rock. Climbers walk by in the sunshine, laughing and talking, never knowing that a dead man is sitting just a few feet beneath their heavy boots. A heavy boot landed right on the edge of the crust, cracking the snow just enough to whisper a warning that nobody was listening to hear. From down below in the dark, the shadows of the living passed overhead like clouds, moving on to the summit while he stayed in hell. That silver clip lay half buried in the ice, a shiny little tombstone marking the exact spot where a simple choice turned into a fatal mistake. The clouds rolled in to swallow the ridge whole, turning the mountain into a gray ghost that keeps its secrets buried deep in the cold. The sun sets on the mountain and the temperature drops like a stone, locking the secret of the hidden trap away for another freezing night. Ice crystals grow across the lens like a spider web, shutting out the view and sealing the story of the man who vanished into the thin air. From high enough up, the tragedy is just a speck of dust, swallowed by the curve of the earth and the blackness of endless space. It ain't always the avalanche that gets you, but the leaking valve, the open zipper, or the tangled rope that seals your fate in the end. The death zone is a quiet place when the wind dies down, a peaceful graveyard touching the stars where the sleepers never wake up again. The sunset paints the snow in colors of fire and blood, a beautiful lie that hides the frozen bodies scattered all across these high peaks. The mountain watches with a face of stone, waiting for the next climber who thinks they are strong enough to survive the small and deadly choices. The dark comes down final and absolute, reminding us all that up here on the roof of the world, the mountain always wins in the end.